Is the Bible true? The internal evidence test. In the first test for manuscript reliability, called the bibliography test, we saw how the Bible passes this test with flying colors. More manuscripts and older manuscripts of the Bible survive today in comparison to all other literature of antiquity. But the bibliographical test only determines that the text we now have is what was originally recorded. How is it that we can believe these texts? This brings us to the second test historians use to analyze ancient literature. It's called the internal evidence test. In this test, a book is weighed as to whether authors can be trusted to tell the truth, and for this test, a text must be approached objectively. John Warwick Montgomery, lawyer, professor, and theologian, says this: "One must listen to the claims of the document under analysis and not assume fraud or error unless the author disqualifies himself by contradiction or known factual inaccuracies." For the internal evidence test, we look at the pages within the Bible. Historians are looking for internal coherence. For example, if the four gospel writers, all testifying to the life of Christ, contradict one another on a crucial point in Christ's life, well, that would be a problem. This was exactly why the scholars rejected what were called the Gnostic Gospels. They contained irreconcilable differences when compared to the rest of the testimonies about Jesus. It's a great benefit to have four independent testimonies to Jesus as found in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. They didn't sit down together to write. No, they wrote from separate locations and at separate times. This means that we can examine their reports and check for coherence. The internal evidence test also looks at the writer's historical accuracy. For example, Luke wrote his gospel about Christ's life and then continued to write the Acts of the Apostles after Jesus died. Multiple scholars have confirmed at least 84 details as being historically accurate and therefore true. Dr. John McRae was an archaeologist and professor emeritus of New Testament at Wheaton College, and he wrote this about Dr. Luke. Quote, "He's erudite," meaning that he's very learned and scholarly. He's eloquent. His Greek approach has classical quality. He writes as an educated man, and archaeological discoveries are showing over and over again that Luke is accurate in what he has to say. End quote. In the New Testament, internal evidence test reveals many individual authors of books who were eyewitnesses or who had carefully investigated the truth, as we see with Dr. Luke. But there are lots of popular religious books whose authors claim to be eyewitnesses and inspired by God, and that doesn't make their writing true. Two examples of this are Joseph Smith, who wrote the Book of Mormon, and Muhammad, who wrote a revelation called the Quran. In both cases, the authors received revelations that no one else can verify. They were written down for whoever would believe them. But the New Testament accounts were circulated during the lives of Christ's contemporaries, people whose lives overlapped with Christ and who could confirm or deny the claims. The New Testament writers actually appeal to common knowledge about Jesus. They say things like, "We saw this," or "We heard that." These writers even speak directly to their critics. Quote, "You also know about these things. You saw them too." The disciples of Jesus couldn't afford to risk inaccuracies because there were plenty of hostile witnesses who would have exposed them and served as a corrective. And so the internal evidence test helps us to see whether a book is consistent within itself or filled with contradictions. In the next video, we'll look at a third major test used to evaluate ancient literature called the external evidence test.